Have you ever sensed that there's more happening behind the scenes of history than what we read in textbooks or watch in documentaries? That the ancient world wasn't just ruled by kings and armies, but by unseen powers that influenced culture, law, and even worship? This is one of those stories. A story that runs deeper than myth, longer than empire, and more dangerously into the present than most realize. This is the forgotten war between Baal and Yahweh, not just a clash of ancient religions, but a confrontation between truth and deception that shaped nations and still shapes lives today. In this video, we begin a journey into a spiritual conflict that was never meant to be background knowledge. It was central. It affected everything, from how rain fell, to how kings ruled, to how hearts worshipped. Baal, the storm god of Canaan, rose not as a mere local deity, but as a cultural force. He promised power, prosperity, fertility, and influence. But what looked like divinity was a mask for spiritual slavery. Yahweh, on the other hand, called for loyalty, truth, and covenant. He didn't just demand worship, he offered relationship. And between them stood a people constantly pulled in both directions. What happened in the land of Israel thousands of years ago is not just ancient history, it's a mirror. The idols may have changed form, but their voices have not gone silent. What Baal offered then, control, success, sensuality, is still marketed today in every corner of our culture. And just like in ancient days, people are still tempted to bow, even if they no longer realize whose altar they're kneeling at. The goal of this series is not just to inform, but to awaken. To pull back the curtain on the war that never ended. To help you recognize it, not in dusty ruins, but in everyday life. So if content like this speaks to you, if you're drawn to deep spiritual truths and timeless battles that still affect our world today, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Click the like button so we know this kind of message matters. And leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, or what parts of this story resonate with you personally. You're not just watching a video. You're stepping into a conversation that spans millennia. In this first chapter, we'll set the stage for what's to come. Before we examine who Baal was, before we walk with Elijah up Mount Carmel, before we see Jezebel's influence or Jeremiah's tears, we must ask why this story has been so overlooked. Why has this ancient spiritual war been ignored, softened, or rebranded as mythology? Could it be that its message is too piercing, too revealing for modern ears? Could it be that we have been taught to forget it on purpose? The truth is, the confrontation between Baal and Yahweh exposes something many would rather not face, that what we worship shapes everything. That spiritual compromise is not neutral, that there really is a war between truth and counterfeit, and that every generation must decide which voice it will follow. This war didn't end in ancient Israel. It didn't stop in Babylon. It didn't fade with time. It continues right now, right here. And it starts by opening our eyes. Baal did not begin as a supreme god. He was not the creator of the heavens or the giver of breath. His name, which means Lord or Master, emerged from a culture steeped in fear and survival, where the rhythms of life were dictated by unpredictable seasons and unstable rulers. In the lands of Canaan, where rain could mean life and drought could mean death, people looked to the skies for answers. When the clouds gathered and thunder rolled, they believed they had found their answer. They called him Baal. To the ancient Canaanites, Baal was not only the storm god, he was the god who controlled fertility, of the earth, of animals, and even of the womb. His image rose in prominence not because he offered peace or justice, but because he promised results. His worship spread through the valleys and hilltops because people were desperate to survive, and Baal seemed to offer immediate solutions. He was the god who brought the rain, made the crops grow, and gave kings victory in war. In a world defined by uncertainty, he became the symbol of control. And yet, what looked like power was a facade. Baal was never a giver of life. His mythology told stories of battles against death, of dying and rising with the seasons. But these stories echoed human struggle more than divine authority. His rituals required performance, not faithfulness. His priests shouted and cut themselves to gain his attention. They danced and bled on high places, hoping to manipulate the weather. This was not a relationship, it was spiritual transaction. A desperate effort to extract blessing through spectacle. It is no wonder that Baal's worship was seductive. It demanded much, but it appeared to offer more. It allowed the people to feel as though they had some influence over the divine. Baal worship put humanity in the center, not as beloved children, but as bargaining partners. In contrast to Yahweh, who required trust, obedience, and covenant love, Baal required ritualistic loyalty fueled by fear. His temples became places where the sacred was twisted, where worship blurred into manipulation, and where moral boundaries collapsed beneath the weight of cultural acceptance. Baal's rise was not just political or theological. It was psychological. He represented an escape from the invisible demands of righteousness into the visible system of results. If the crops grew, if the rain fell, if the trade routes prospered, then Baal must be pleased. And if he was not, the solution was more performance, more ritual, more sacrifice. This is where the darkness deepened. Because Baal's worship was not harmless or symbolic. It demanded more than song or incense. Over time it grew darker, more desperate, more corrupt. It included sacred prostitution. It justified violence. It culminated in the offering of children, burned on altars to ensure the rains would return. These were not isolated cases of extremism. They were woven into the very fabric of Baal's worship. In the name of survival, in the name of prosperity, humanity surrendered its soul. The priests of Baal stood in positions of influence. They shaped the spiritual climate of cities. They influenced kings and queens. They justified the unthinkable by the promise of prosperity. And behind it all stood a spiritual force not seeking the good of humanity, but its bondage. The rise of Baal was not just a religious movement, it was a spiritual invasion. A counterfeit kingdom erected to rival the throne of God, built on fear, performance, and blood. And yet people chose it. Again and again, they turned from the covenant of Yahweh to the rituals of Baal. Because Baal asked less of the heart, he did not require holiness. He did not demand justice. He offered control, or at least the illusion of it. His temples offered pleasure without purity, success without surrender, rain without righteousness. This was the great trade, glory exchanged for thunder. The intimate presence of Yahweh, who walked with his people and spoke through prophets, traded for the distant roar of storms that could be summoned if only the price was high enough. And the people paid that price, not knowing that behind the thunder stood emptiness. In Canaanite stories, Baal wrestled with Mo, the god of death, in an endless cycle. He died, then returned, then died again. His followers mirrored this cycle in endless striving, bound to a God who could never offer lasting victory over death. Yahweh, by contrast, spoke of life that did not depend on ritual but on relationship. He revealed himself not in chaos, but in covenant. Not in the noise of thunder, but in the steadiness of truth. Still, Baal's popularity grew. His name became common. His image was carved on stone and erected in public places. He was not just worshipped in Canaan, but absorbed into surrounding cultures. His influence extended to Phoenicia, Aram, and eventually even into the northern kingdom of Israel. He was not resisted. He was welcomed, sometimes by force, other times by fascination. And in many hearts, the line between Yahweh and Baal began to blur. This blending of worship did not happen overnight. It was slow, subtle, persuasive. It began with curiosity, then admiration, then compromise, until Baal no longer stood outside the gates but inside the sanctuary. The rise of Baal marked more than a shift in spiritual loyalty. It was a fracture of identity. The people who had been called to reflect the holiness of Yahweh, who were chosen to be a light to the nations, became instead a mirror to the cultures around them. And when identity collapses, worship follows. To understand why so many turn to Baal, one must look not just at his temples, but into the human heart. The desire for control, the fear of scarcity, the longing to belong. These are not ancient struggles. They are universal and timeless. Baal did not rise because he was real. He rose because people believed what he offered. They believed he could provide. They believed he was powerful. And in doing so, they traded the glory of the incorruptible God for the image of a God made in their own likeness. And what a costly trade it was. Long before stone altars to Baal rose in the high places of Canaan, before the groves were filled with ritual chants and sacred prostitution, a voice had already spoken, not from a storm, not from behind clouds, but from the silence of a star-filled night. A voice called to a man named Abram and asked him to look up, not at a carved idol, but at the heavens themselves. The stars were uncountable, the sky infinite, and the promise even greater. From one man, God would raise a people. From one covenant, he would form a nation. And from that nation, a testimony to the world would emerge, not about how to manipulate the divine, but how to walk with him. This was not mythology. It was the foundation of relationship. Abraham was not promised control over the seasons or access to fertility rituals. He was promised presence, that Yahweh would be his shield, his reward, his God. And in return, what was asked of him was not performance, but trust. Not ritual sacrifice to gain divine favor, but a willingness to believe even when the fulfillment was not visible. That promise echoed down the generations. It was renewed with Isaac, confirmed through Jacob, and sealed in fire and smoke on Mount Sinai, when Moses stood trembling before the God who descended in glory. But even then, the covenant was not merely a set of laws. It was an invitation. I will be your God, and you will be my people. The terms were not cold commands, but instructions for life, designed to shape a people who would reflect the nature of the one they served. In a land surrounded by gods who demanded to be appeased, Yahweh stood alone in holiness. He could not be bribed. He did not sleep. He did not need feeding or flattery. He required something far more challenging, loyalty from the heart. This made the covenant unique. While surrounding nations brought offerings to maintain favor with their gods, Israel was taught to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. The Torah, the festivals, the tabernacle, all of it pointed to the central reality that the God of Israel was not distant, but present. Unlike Baal, who had to be summoned with loud cries, Yahweh chose to dwell among his people. His glory filled the tabernacle. His voice guided them through prophets. His cloud led them by day, and his fire by night. Every detail of the covenant carried the fingerprint of a God who was not only holy, but personal. He was not watching from afar, but walking beside. And every act of obedience was not a bribe, but a response to love. Yet the land into which this covenant people entered was already soaked in spiritual corruption. The soil they inherited had known the blood of pagan sacrifices. The trees had shaded unclean rituals. The culture was not neutral, it was defiled. And so the call was clear. Do not adopt their ways. Do not bow to their gods. Do not blend the truth with lies. Tear down the altars. Destroy the high places. Be separate. Be holy. Because Yahweh had not brought them out of Egypt to become like the nations, but to be a contrast to them. But over time, the contrast began to fade. The lines blurred. The commandments became negotiable. The people wanted the fruit of covenant without the root of obedience. They still invoked the name of Yahweh, but their hearts leaned toward the ease of Baal. It was easier to follow a God who only required ritual than one who demanded relationship. Easier to offer a sacrifice than to surrender pride. Easier to fit in with neighbors than to stand apart. The covenant was never meant to be heavy, but holy. It was never a burden, it was a bond. Yet in a land saturated with idolatry, faithfulness required courage. Obedience looked strange. And in moments of drought, or fear, or conflict, the people often defaulted to what they saw around them. The influence of the Canaanite worldview crept in, not through conquest, but through compromise. What made Yahweh different became what made him inconvenient. He did not operate on superstition. He did not reward manipulation. He was not a seasonal God who came and went. He was always present, always seeing, always calling. And that relentless presence demanded more than external gestures. It demanded truth from the inward parts, as Psalm 51 verse 6 later declared. It demanded that the people not just worship in ceremony, but in spirit. To live under covenant with Yahweh was to be formed, not flattered. He called his people not to conform to the land, but to redeem it. Every law, every statute, every appointed feast was a reminder that their lives were not their own. They belonged to a God who had chosen them, not for their size or strength, but because he loved them. And still, love can be betrayed. The covenant was broken, not because Yahweh was unfaithful, but because the hearts of his people wandered. They kept the forms, but not the fire. They said the words, but did not mean them. And slowly, the name of Yahweh was invoked alongside the name of Baal, as if they were equals, as if the holy could be mixed with the profane. The prophets would later cry out against this betrayal, but even before their voices echoed through Israel's streets, the covenant itself warned of the consequences. Blessings for obedience, curses for rebellion. Not because Yahweh was vengeful, but because relationship has boundaries. A holy God cannot dwell in a people who cling to idols. What was offered through the covenant was not just safety or success. It was shalom, wholeness, a life where every part was aligned with the truth of who God is. It was a life where justice reigned, where the poor were protected, where families flourished, and where worship was pure. But shalom cannot survive where idols dwell. It cannot take root where the heart is divided. To remember the covenant is to remember what was at stake. Not just law, but love. Not just territory, but testimony. Israel was not chosen to dominate the nations, but to display a different kind of kingdom, one marked by mercy, by justice, by the presence of a God who hears, who speaks, who leads, and who never fails. And yet, as the land was possessed, as the vineyards were harvested, as the cities were built, the covenant became background noise. Familiarity bred forgetfulness. And in the comfort of prosperity, the whispers of Baal began to sound more appealing. The rain seemed to come quicker. The rituals seemed more exciting. The crowds followed them. And the covenant voice of Yahweh grew faint, not because he stopped speaking, but because they stopped listening. The mountain rose sharply against the northern skyline, its rugged peaks overlooking the Jezreel Valley, where kings marched and crops swayed in the breeze that often carried the scent of rain or the ache of drought. Mount Carmel was no stranger to storms. It had felt the clash of clouds, the rumbles of thunder, and the tension that came with unsettled skies. But on this particular day, the storm that loomed was not in the heavens, but in the hearts of a nation that had lost its way. The people stood divided, uncertain, waiting for a question that had long gone unanswered. Who is God? The silence had already lasted 3 years. Not a drop of rain, not a single harvest worth celebrating. The land cracked and groaned beneath the curse that mirrored the spiritual famine in Israel. The fields were dry, but so were the hearts. And at the center of it all stood one man, carrying a burden few would dare to touch. Elijah, the prophet from Tishbe, had become the most wanted man in the land, not because he had broken laws, but because he had spoken truth. He had dared to challenge a system that propped up Baal as the giver of rain and life, while Yahweh, the true God, was pushed to the margins. Now the moment had come. Not in secret, not in whispers, but on a stage for the entire nation to see. The king, Ahab, had been summoned. The prophets of Baal, 450 strong, dressed in their religious garb, had been gathered. The crowd stretched across the slopes of Carmel, a mixture of curiosity and fear. And Elijah, alone in number but not in power, stood to speak. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. It was not just a challenge, it was a call to clarity. The people had spent years in confusion, mixing truth with lies, blending worship with idolatry, invoking Yahweh while offering sacrifices to Baal. Elijah's words cut through the fog. This was not about theology. This was about truth. And truth was about to be tested by fire. The rules were simple. 2 bulls, 2 altars, 2 prayers. No fire lit by human hand. The God who answered by fire, he is God. What followed was a display that exposed more than religious ritual. It laid bare the futility of false worship. The prophets of Baal began early, calling out to their God, dancing around the altar, crying with increasing desperation. As the sun climbed higher, so did their frenzy. They slashed themselves with swords, spilling blood in a grim attempt to provoke response. But Baal did not answer. No voice came. No fire fell. And Elijah, watching, did not stay silent. He mocked their performance, not out of arrogance, but as a mirror to the madness. "Shout louder," he said. "Perhaps your God is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Perhaps he is sleeping." The sarcasm carried weight because the truth it revealed was devastating. Baal was not sleeping, he was nothing. The God who was supposed to command the storm could not even spark a flame. By the time evening approached, the prophets of Baal were exhausted, bloodied, and defeated by their own emptiness. And then Elijah stepped forward. No frenzy, no shouting, no theatrics. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord, using 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, a symbolic act reminding the people who they were and whose they were. He arranged the wood, placed the bull on it, and then, in an act that defied all logic, he ordered water to be poured over the sacrifice. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Water filled the trench. Everything was soaked. No spark would catch here by accident. What was about to happen could only come from heaven. Then Elijah prayed, not with elaborate words, but with conviction. "Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command." The prayer was not for display. It was not to manipulate. It was to declare. And in response, fire fell. Not lightning, not a random flash. A consuming, holy fire that devoured everything. The sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the water. It left no doubt. It did not flicker. It roared. It burned away ambiguity, pierced through idolatry, and reignited the covenant that had been buried under layers of compromise. The people fell face down. They did not need further proof. "The Lord, he is God." The declaration echoed across the slopes and into the hearts. What Baal could not produce with hours of performance, Yahweh delivered in a moment of power. This was not just a supernatural event. It was a reordering of reality, a return to truth, a national awakening. But the story was not only about victory. It was about revelation. Baal's silence was more than the absence of sound. It was the exposure of falsehood. And Yahweh's fire was not merely spectacle. It was a confirmation of identity. The people belonged to him. They had always belonged to him. And now, standing before the remnants of an altar that no longer existed, they remembered. What unfolded on Mount Carmel was not just a confrontation between 2 religious systems. It was a collision between presence and pretense, between covenant and convenience. Elijah did not win because he was louder. He prevailed because he stood aligned with the God who answers by fire. And that fire was not just a sign, it was a summons to return, to rebuild, to reject the lie that thunder could replace glory. The turning of a nation seldom begins with revolution. It begins with whispers. Not the kind that erupt from thrones or shout from city gates, but the quieter ones that slither beneath conviction, questioning boundaries, reframing truth, asking gently, what if both could be true? Baal worship did not conquer Israel through brute force or theological debates. It crept in like a shadow that knew the terrain, familiar with the sacred spaces it sought to defile. What began as external influence soon found a home within the heart of the people who were once called to stand apart. The danger was not in obvious rebellion, but in spiritual dilution. No one announced the death of covenant. No royal decree was issued to erase the name of Yahweh. Instead, what emerged was a blending, a mixture that turned clarity into confusion. The kings, entrusted with the protection of the nation's spiritual integrity, became the gatekeepers of compromise. They aligned themselves with foreign alliances, welcomed the daughters of idolaters into their courts, and with them came not just new languages and customs, but gods that demanded space in temples never built for them. The priests, who once ministered before the Ark of the Covenant, began to echo the patterns of the nations around them. Some still invoked the name of Yahweh, but their sacrifices no longer carried the weight of obedience. They adopted the ceremonies of Baal, softened the commandments, replaced altars of repentance with platforms of performance. The distinction between holy and profane was blurred, until the people no longer noticed they had crossed a line. Sacred spaces, designed for the presence of God, were repurposed for spectacle. The high places, once condemned by the prophets, became centers of activity. Groves were planted, images carved, incense offered, and the people who once trembled at Sinai now bowed under trees to gods who never spoke. The shift was so gradual, so culturally accepted, that few recognized it as betrayal. It felt practical. It felt inclusive. It felt modern. But what felt modern was in fact ancient deception, dressed in new robes. Baal worship appealed to the senses. It involved festivals, sensuality, pageantry, and power. It made religion look alive, even as it hollowed out the soul. It offered immediacy, rain now, blessing now, results now. Unlike Yahweh, who often called his people to wait, to trust, to walk by faith when sight failed. The seductive pull of Baal was not just in his promises, but in the permission he granted. There were no moral absolutes, no covenantal boundaries. The gods of the nations did not care about justice, mercy, or truth. They could be served in the midst of corruption. And that suited leaders who wanted the benefits of divine favor without the cost of divine accountability. Kings could expand their borders, enjoy wealth, and maintain popularity without concern for the orphan or the widow. Priests could keep their robes clean while their hands were stained. And the people followed, because they were tired of waiting, tired of trusting, tired of carrying the weight of faith in a world that rewarded compromise. They began to speak of Yahweh and Baal in the same breath, assuming both could be honored, both could be worshipped. Syncretism was not just theological confusion, it was spiritual adultery. It was the betrayal of a relationship in favor of a transaction. The holy God of Israel was no longer their husband, but just another name on their list of divine suppliers. This was not just a cultural crisis. It was a covenantal fracture. Every feast celebrated in Baal's name was a rejection of the table Yahweh had set. Every ritual performed in the high places was a statement that his presence was no longer enough. The nation had not stopped worshiping. They had simply redirected their worship toward what was easier to control. Yet worship is not something that can be shared. It demands exclusivity. The Shema, declared daily in Israel, made that clear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Not part, not mixed, all. And to break that was not only sin, it was betrayal of identity. But the tragedy of syncretism is that it doesn't announce itself as rebellion. It disguises itself as balance, as nuance, as relevance. It wears the language of progress while dismantling the foundations of truth. In Israel, it began with kings like Jeroboam, who introduced golden calves under the guise of national unity. It was deepened by rulers who married foreign wives and permitted their gods to be worshipped openly. By the time of Ahab, Baal was no longer an outside influence. He had become normalized, institutionalized, defended. The prophets wept, but their cries were drowned out by celebrations on pagan altars. The fire of Mount Carmel had not yet fallen, and the nation moved toward judgment unaware. Yet what Israel did in the physical, the human heart still does in the spiritual. The temptation to blend, to compromise, to seek the benefits of faith without the surrender it requires. That temptation remains as strong now as it was then. Even today, sacred spaces are infiltrated by the same spirit. The idols have changed shape, but not substance. The modern world may not bow to carved statues of storm gods, but it still bows to power, sensuality, wealth, and the desire to control outcomes. The language of faith remains, but often stripped of its weight, its reverence, its exclusivity. The truth is edited to accommodate convenience. The worship of Yahweh is declared with lips, while the altars of Baal are maintained in hidden corners of the heart. What happened in ancient Israel is not a story locked in the past. It is a warning for every generation that seeks to honor God while clinging to what He opposes. The seduction of the sacred is real. It does not come in broad defiance, but in subtle redefinitions. It asks only for a little compromise, a small accommodation, a silent tolerance. But every inch given is ground surrendered. Every step away is a step toward forgetting. And when sacred becomes profane, when covenant becomes culture, when worship becomes performance, the fire that once marked the presence of God becomes only memory. Unless hearts turn back, power, when untethered from righteousness, becomes a weapon dressed in royalty. In the court of Israel, where kings once knelt in humility before the Ark of the Covenant, a new presence emerged, not robed in priestly garments, nor bearing the sacred oil of anointing, but veiled in influence, seduction, and dominion. Her name was Jezebel, and with her came not just a foreign crown, but a foreign spirit that sought to redefine the soul of a nation. Her arrival marked more than a political alliance. It was the enthronement of an ideology crafted to dismantle truth from within the palace. Jezebel was no mere queen by title. She was the daughter of Baal, king of the Sidonians, high priest of Baal himself. And she carried more than heritage, she carried an agenda. She did not enter Israel to adapt or assimilate, but to transform. And unlike the silent infiltration of syncretism that crept in through cultural drift, Jezebel's influence was direct, forceful, and absolute. She did not hide her allegiance. She wore it openly, building temples to Baal within the very heart of Israel, erecting Asherah poles, funding the prophets of false gods with royal provision, and exterminating the prophets of Yahweh with calculated vengeance. Where previous kings tolerated idolatry, Jezebel enthroned it. What had once been the whisper of compromise became the roar of domination. Her power was not merely exercised through laws, but through spiritual intimidation. She didn't just seek to change worship, she sought to silence it. Her mission was not merely to elevate Baal, but to erase Yahweh. And in that mission, she did not hesitate to shed blood. Elijah's confrontation on Mount Carmel, though victorious in fire, triggered a counterattack more personal and targeted. Jezebel, enraged by the exposure and defeat of her prophets, swore by her gods that Elijah would not live another day. This was not just a threat from a queen. It was the voice of a spirit that has echoed throughout history. The spirit that cannot tolerate truth. The spirit that demands submission. The spirit that uses power to suffocate the prophetic voice. What Jezebel unleashed was not just persecution. It was a system. A structure where falsehood was protected by force and truth was treated as treason. The people were expected to conform, not by persuasion, but by fear. Baal was no longer one god among many, he became the state religion. Yahweh was not merely ignored, he was outlawed. And the prophets who still carried his name were driven into caves, isolated and hunted like criminals. This is where Jezebel's legacy becomes more than history, it becomes a pattern. Because the war she waged was never simply about altars or ideologies. It was about influence, control, voice. She understood that truth, when spoken boldly, shakes thrones. And so she did everything possible to silence it. In her world, Elijah was not just a prophet, he was a threat. And like every power drunk on its own authority, she believed that eliminating the voice would eliminate the reality it proclaimed. But truth, by nature, cannot be killed. It can be driven underground. It can be mocked, hunted, and denied. But it cannot be erased. Even as Elijah fled into the wilderness, believing himself alone, Yahweh revealed that a remnant still remained. 7,000 who had not bowed to Baal or kissed him. The voice of God was not extinguished. It was waiting, refined by the fire of persecution, prepared for the next season of revelation. Jezebel's legacy did not end with her death, which came in poetic justice. Thrown from a window by her own attendants, her blood splattered on the walls of the palace she once ruled. But the spirit that animated her did not die with her body. It continued to work through systems, leaders, and ideologies that oppose the authority of God and suppress His voice. The spirit is subtle in its disguise but ruthless in its aim. It targets the prophetic, not merely those who foretell, but those who stand for truth uncompromised. It manipulates emotion, distorts identity, weaponizes seduction, and uses fear to maintain control. It flatters the powerful, silences dissent, and twists language until light is called darkness and evil is declared good. In the modern age, the spirit of Jezebel does not always wear a crown, but it often sits at influential tables. It does not always build altars to Baal, but it builds platforms where truth is negotiated, and conviction is labeled intolerance. It does not always execute prophets with swords, but it cancels them with social pressure, shamas them into silence, or isolates them into irrelevance. It does not need to remove Yahweh's name, only to replace His voice with noise. And yet, just as in the days of Elijah, the remnant remains. Those who will not bow, those who still carry the fire of truth, those who speak not for approval, but for alignment with the one who sees in secret and speaks in whispers. The confrontation between Elijah and Jezebel was not just a moment in Israel's past. It was a portrait of every generation's spiritual tension. The contest between the voice of heaven and the machinery of deception. Jezebel did not fear religion. She welcomed it, so long as it bowed to her terms. What she feared was a God who could not be controlled, a word that could not be reshaped, a prophet who would not retreat. That is what she tried to destroy. That is what the Spirit still seeks to destroy. But the fire had already fallen. The covenant had already been renewed. And though Elijah would flee for a moment, the voice of Yahweh had not grown quiet. It had only become more focused. It is one thing to speak truth with thunder, another to weep with it. Not every prophet arrived with fire from heaven. Some came with trembling hands and eyes swollen from sleepless nights. They were not welcomed into royal courts. Their words rarely inspired cheers. They carried scrolls, not swords, and tears, not applause. Among them were voices shaped not only by revelation, but by sorrow. They did not simply declare judgment, they felt it. They did not just speak for God, they ached with Him. And in the midst of national rebellion, in a time when Baal's name echoed louder than Yahweh's, men like Jeremiah and Hosea stood bearing a burden few could understand. They were not just prophets. They were the broken-hearted watchmen of a covenant being trampled. Jeremiah's call was not wrapped in celebration. From the very beginning, his path was one of rejection. He spoke during the unraveling years of Judah's slow collapse, as the nation spiraled deeper into spiritual corruption. The temple still stood. Priests still performed their duties. But the heart of worship had long since been gutted. Baal's influence had not only polluted high places, it had infiltrated the sacred center. And Jeremiah, too young to be taken seriously by many, was called to be a voice that would not be silenced. He was not sent with easy answers, but with a mirror, one that showed the people how far they had drifted. He spoke of cisterns, broken ones, carved by their own hands, leaking water, unable to hold what they craved. He cried out against the priests who had stopped asking, "Where is the Lord?" He rebuked the prophets who prophesied by Baal and led the people astray. But beneath every rebuke, there pulsed a deeper ache, not of a distant deity, but of a faithful husband watching his bride chase other lovers. Again and again, Yahweh pleaded through Jeremiah's voice, "Return to me," not for fear of punishment, but because the relationship mattered. The grief in Jeremiah's words was not born of anger alone, it was born of love. A love betrayed, wounded, but still pursuing. And as Jeremiah walked the streets of Jerusalem, witnessing the sacrifices offered on pagan altars, the burning of children to foreign gods, and the priests nodding in approval, his heart shattered, not only for his people, but with his God. He was known as the weeping prophet not because he was weak, but because he felt what Yahweh felt. His tears were not simply personal, they were prophetic. His anguish mirrored heaven's, and though the people mocked him, beat him, and threw him into cisterns, he continued to speak, because truth must be spoken, even when it costs everything. But the story of grief did not begin with Jeremiah. Long before Babylon's armies surrounded Jerusalem, another voice had cried out, one not formed in the courts of kings, but in the heartbreak of a marriage. Hosea's story is unlike any other, because it was not just spoken, it was lived. He was not told to preach a message, he was told to marry it. Gomer was her name, a woman who would betray him repeatedly, abandoning his home for other lovers, returning only to leave again. And Yahweh, in perhaps one of the most shocking commands ever given to a prophet, told Hosea to take her back, to love her again, to pursue her, to buy her back from the auction block. Why? Because that was Israel. That was the covenant story. Yahweh had chosen a people, clothed them in beauty, given them identity, and called them his own. And in return, they had prostituted themselves to Baal. They ran after gods who offered nothing but took everything. They exchanged faithfulness for infidelity and truth for a lie. Yet Yahweh, the betrayed one, still longed for them. He did not cut them off. He called them home. Hosea's life became a living parable, a walking testimony of divine sorrow. Every time he searched the streets for his unfaithful wife, he carried the weight of heaven's heartbreak. Every time he welcomed her back, he revealed something the altars of Baal could never offer: mercy, forgiveness, a love that refuses to let go. And though the prophets warned of judgment, the judgment was never detached from compassion. Yahweh did not rejoice in destruction, he wept over it. He delayed it, again and again, sending messengers not to condemn, but to call. If only they would turn. If only they would remember. The commandments were not chains, they were cords of kindness. The covenant was not a contract, it was a vow. The pain of the prophets was the pain of knowing what could have been. They saw the beauty of what Israel was meant to be, a light to the nations, a holy people, a treasured possession. And they watched as that calling was squandered in pursuit of gods made by hands. The golden calf had never truly died. It had simply changed shape, and the people had returned to it, again and again. What made their words heavy was not the severity of the warnings, but the depth of the sorrow behind them. They spoke not as hired preachers, but as wounded lovers. They were not content to rebuke from a distance. They entered into the suffering, sharing in the heartbreak, pleading not just with arguments, but with tears. Their legacy remains not because they were popular, but because they were faithful. They remind every generation that idolatry is not just rebellion, it is betrayal. That God's jealousy is not petty, but holy. That his anger flows from wounded love, not pride. And that even in the midst of wrath, his heart remains open. The prophets wept because Yahweh wept. They wept because a people called to intimacy had chosen infidelity. They wept because the sacred had been sold for spectacle, and the covenant was being trampled beneath the feet of those who once danced in its joy. Yet even in the darkest moments, their voices carried hope, not because the people deserved it, but because Yahweh's love is deeper than their failure. Through every lament, through every cry, through every broken-hearted plea, one message kept rising: return. Return to me, for I am merciful. One does not need to walk through Canaan's ruined high places or dig beneath layers of ancient soil to find Baal's shadow. He never truly left. His name may have faded from daily speech, his temples long reduced to dust, but what he represented, what he seduced humanity with, has been neither buried nor broken. The spirit behind him, the appetite he stirred, the illusion he sold, still lingers in the modern world with new masks, new rituals, and new altars. Today, we may not pour wine before carved stone or lay offerings on smoking groves beneath oak trees, but the hunger remains. The longing for control over nature, the thirst for affirmation, the obsession with results, and the endless pursuit of prosperity still burn at the core of human striving. Baal has become more sophisticated, more refined, more marketable, but his message remains unchanged: serve me, and I will give you what you want. Modern culture does not call these forces gods, but it treats them as such. Success has its own liturgies. Fame has its temples built with screens and spotlights. Power demands its sacrifices, sometimes of truth, sometimes of time, sometimes of self. Sensuality has become sanctified under the banner of freedom, and the pursuit of wealth is often cloaked in the language of blessing. We no longer call them idols, but we devote our lives to them, structure our days around them, and shape our identities through them. And like the prophets of Baal, we dance for them, we perform, we strive. We cut ourselves on the altars of approval, constantly measuring worth by numbers, of followers, of dollars, of achievements. We bow to trends. We offer our peace in exchange for popularity. We burn through energy, through time, through relationships, just to summon a response from something that cannot speak. The tragedy is not just that the modern world chases these things, but that it sanctifies the chase. It calls it ambition, calls it progress, calls it evolution. But in truth, it is the same old hunger in a digital skin. And the more we feed it, the more it asks. Baal was never satisfied. Neither is what he represents today. It always demands more sacrifice, more compromise, more attention. Even in spaces meant to be sacred, these idols have crept in. Churches shaped by performance rather than presence. Worship measured not by reverence, but by production value. Ministries that preach success as evidence of righteousness, reducing faith to a transaction. The language has changed, but the structure is familiar. The blending of Yahweh's truth with Baal's promises is not a relic of ancient Israel. It is the quiet crisis of today's believers. Discernment now requires more than identifying statues. It requires the courage to ask, what am I really worshiping? What shapes my decisions? What drives my emotions? Where do I find my identity? If anything or anyone takes the place where Yahweh alone should rule, if any pursuit demands more of our attention, our energy, our loyalty than he does, then the altar has already been built and the fire is already burning. The modern Baals are not satisfied with partial devotion. They press into the margins until they occupy the center. They do not mind the name of Yahweh being mentioned, so long as it is stripped of its weight, reduced to a brand or a slogan. They thrive in lukewarm spaces, in diluted truth, in hearts that sing songs of surrender, but live lives of self-preservation. Yet even now, the call of Elijah echoes, how long will you waver between two opinions? The tension remains. The choice remains. And the silence of modern idols is as deafening as it was on Mount Carmel. They cannot answer. They cannot save. They cannot love. To resist them is not merely to renounce them with words, but to replace them with truth. The truth that Yahweh does not demand performance, he desires presence. That he is not summoned by spectacle, he abides with the humble. That he does not trade in manipulation, he invites relationship. To tear down modern Baals is to take inventory of the soul, to examine the hidden places where compromise has taken root. It is to reclaim sacred ground not with anger, but with reverence. It is to silence the noise and listen again for the still small voice that will never compete for attention but always speaks when we make space. This confrontation is not theoretical, it is personal. Each heart holds its own high places. Each life builds its own altars. The war between Yahweh and Baal is no longer played out on mountains before kings. It plays out in choices, in priorities, in quiet moments of decision. But there is freedom, true, deep, lasting freedom. Not the counterfeit liberty that promises everything and leaves us empty, but the freedom that comes from alignment with what is real. Yahweh does not offer the illusion of power, He offers peace. He does not bribe with blessing, He gives identity. And He calls, not with coercion, but with the voice of one who has always known us. To discern the modern Baals is not to retreat from the world, but to walk through it with open eyes and a grounded heart. It is to worship in spirit and in truth, to love what He loves, to say yes to His way even when it costs more than applause. Not every victory feels like triumph. Sometimes, even after the fire falls, the soul falters. Mountaintop moments, no matter how spectacular, are often followed by valleys of uncertainty. Elijah had stood alone before a nation, faced hundreds of prophets, called down fire from heaven, and watched as the people bowed in confession. Yet soon after, he found himself running, not from an army, but from a voice. Jezebel's threat pierced through the memory of fire and reignited a fear that no miracle could extinguish. The prophet who had defied kings now hid beneath a broom tree, praying not for guidance, but for death. What unfolded next was not a failure of faith, but a revelation of humanity. Elijah was not weak because he wept. He was not disqualified because he doubted. His collapse did not disprove his calling. It revealed a deeper layer of God's nature, a side often hidden when thunder is crashing and crowds are cheering. In Elijah's silence, the voice of Yahweh would speak again, not with judgment, but with intimacy. The journey to Mount Horeb was long, and Yahweh made sure Elijah survived it. An angel was sent, not with punishment, but with food. Rest was offered before instruction. Provision came before correction. There was no divine rebuke, no immediate demand for more faith. Just care, just presence. And when Elijah finally reached the mountain where Moses had once stood, where commandments had once been carved into stone, the prophet took shelter in a cave. The question came, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was not a demand for explanation. It was a gentle invitation, a space to speak. And Elijah poured out his heart, not with polished words, but with raw emotion. He had been zealous, faithful, bold. Yet now he felt alone, abandoned. He believed he was the last one left, and that even his life was forfeit. Yahweh listened. Then came the demonstration. Wind tore through the mountains, shattering rocks in its fury. But Yahweh was not in the wind. An earthquake rumbled the foundations of the land. But Yahweh was not in the earthquake. Fire blazed past the cave's mouth. But Yahweh was not in the fire. Each element echoed the power of earlier moments, spectacle, force, drama. But this time, they passed without revelation. And then, a whisper. A sound gentle enough to be missed by anyone not listening. A still small voice. Not because Yahweh had grown weak, but because he was teaching something deeper. His power did not require performance. His presence did not need volume. The God who could split seas and burn altars could also speak in silence. He was not absent in the quiet. He was most present there. In that whisper, Elijah found more than comfort. He found direction. He was not alone, though it had felt that way. 7,000 had not bowed. A remnant remained. And Elijah's journey was not over. He was still called, still needed, still chosen. But what changed was not just his path. It was his understanding of how God works. This moment became a counterpoint to the drama of Mount Carmel. It revealed a truth that cuts through the noise of every generation. Yahweh does not always move in the ways we expect. The world celebrates volume, demands spectacle, measures strength by how loud or visible something is. But Yahweh's way is not of this world. His authority is not diminished by quietness. His presence is not defined by noise. False gods need noise to feel real. They demand constant affirmation. They require attention, display, validation. They are sustained by drama, by ritual, by frenzy. But the living God does not compete for attention. He waits to be sought. He speaks to those who make room. His voice is not a shout across a crowd, but a whisper to the soul that has come away from the chaos. And in that whisper is power, not the kind that conquers through fear or force, but the kind that heals, transforms, realigns. It speaks identity when the world only offers labels. It gives peace that is not circumstantial. It breaks the noise of anxiety with the clarity of presence. It does not need to shout to prove it is real. It only needs to be heard. Elijah's encounter is a lesson not just for prophets, but for all who walk with God. It reminds us that spiritual maturity is not about constant highs or visible victories. It is about learning to hear the voice that speaks when all other voices fade. It is about knowing that when miracles are absent, God is not. That when fire does not fall, the whisper still speaks. And perhaps more than anything, it shows that Yahweh's relationship with his people is deeply personal. He does not discard those who falter. He does not replace those who run. He meets them in their caves, in their weariness, in their disillusionment. And he speaks, not in rebuke, but in reassurance. Not in wrath, but in whisper. Empires do not rise without altars. Behind every throne, whether gilded in gold or built in blood, there's always a God being served. Often unseen, often unnamed, but always present. The spirit of Baal, long thought buried beneath the dust of Canaanite ruins, did not vanish with the fall of Jezebel or the silence on Carmel. It migrated, adapted, took on new shapes, new languages, new names. As Israel's idolatry deepened and judgment drew near, that same spirit found a new home in the heart of Babylon, the empire that would become the very symbol of opposition to everything Yahweh had ever declared holy. Babylon was not merely a political force. It was a spiritual embodiment, a city, a system, a seduction. Where Baal once reigned as storm god, Babylon now offered the storm of conquest, culture, and confusion, and at its core stood the same defiance. The same counterfeit promise of glory without surrender, knowledge without obedience, immortality without submission. The golden image Nebuchadnezzar set upon the plain of Dura may not have borne Baal's name, but it carried his essence, worship demanded at the cost of integrity, allegiance coerced by fear, truth rewritten by decree. The prophets saw it clearly. Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, they spoke of Babylon not only as an invading force, but as a spiritual reality, a city of pride, of excess, of blood. Babylon was the fruit of what began with Baal, the full flowering of a humanity intoxicated with its own power. And while its armies marched across continents, its ideology marched deeper into the soul of man. Every conquered nation was not just a political victory, it was a spiritual conquest. Temples were looted, altars repurposed, languages rewritten, and Yahweh's name pushed into the margins. Yet even as Babylon rose, Yahweh remained unshaken. For every throne lifted in arrogance, he had already written its fall. The book of Daniel stands as a witness to this divine defiance. In the courts of the most powerful empire on earth, the God of Israel still revealed dreams, shut lions' mouths, and preserved those who refused to bow. The battle was not over. It had only shifted locations. What Baal began on the hills of Israel, Babylon expanded into a global vision of domination. But Babylon too would fall. Its streets, once filled with glory, would be emptied by judgment. Its rivers, once teeming with trade, would carry the lament of a fallen power. Yet the spirit behind it lingered still. It moved from empire to empire, Persia, Greece, Rome, each adopting its philosophies, its patterns, It's gods in disguise. And always, beneath the grandeur, a resistance to Yahweh's rule. Always, a system built to distract, distort, devour. The New Testament writers, living under Roman rule, recognize the same spirit. John, exiled on the island of Patmos, was given a vision, a revelation not just of future events, but of spiritual reality. In the pages of Revelation, Babylon rises again, not as a physical city, but as a harlot, drunk on the blood of the saints, clothed in luxury, deceiving nations with sorcery. She rides the beast. She manipulates kings. She unites religion, politics, and economy into one seductive force. And she wages war, not with swords, but with influence. This is not mythology. This is not poetry. It is prophecy. The final confrontation is not about armies. It is about allegiance. It is about who is worshipped when the pressure rises. It is about who speaks truth when the cost is everything. It is about a world system that still whispers the promises of Baal, security through compromise, prosperity through submission, unity through surrender of conviction, and a God who still speaks through the whisper, calling his people out. The battle lines are not drawn with ink or blood alone. They are drawn in the heart. Every culture, every generation, every soul faces the same question. Will you bow to what is seen, or remain loyal to what is true? The gods of this world no longer ask for incense. They ask for silence. They do not demand temples. They demand your attention, your time, your loyalty. They promise peace, but deliver chains. And yet, the final word does not belong to them. Revelation unveils not only the rise of Babylon, but its fall. Not only the deception of the beast, but the return of the Lamb. The battle ends not in ambiguity, but in fire once more, this time not upon a mountain, but upon a world that must be purified. The king does not come quietly. He comes with eyes like flame and a voice like many waters. And every counterfeit must collapse beneath his feet. The spirit of Baal, reborn through centuries, will be silenced. The seductive song of Babylon will end. But the faithful, those who refused to bow, who did not kiss the idols, who held to the truth when it was costly, they will shine like stars in a darkened sky. The remnant will become the bride. The mourning will become dancing. The whisper will become a shout of victory. The sound of compromise is often quiet. It does not announce itself with drums or declarations, but it weaves its way into decisions, shapes the tone of conversations, and dresses itself in language that feels safe, balanced, inclusive, modern. Yet beneath its surface is the same pull that seduced ancient Israel, the same invitation that drew hearts toward Baal, the same lie wrapped in new vocabulary, that faith can be divided, that allegiance can be shared, that holiness can be negotiated. The call to come out of Babylon is not a call for relocation. It is a call for reformation, for separation in spirit, for a cleansing of the soul's sanctuary. To leave Babylon is to refuse her wine, to silence her music, to walk away from her promises even when they shine with the brilliance of success. Revelation does not merely describe her fall. It commands something deeper, something that echoes the cries of the prophets who tore their garments when Israel turned to other gods. Come out of her, my people. The words are not a suggestion. They are a cry of urgency. They are the sound of Yahweh pleading for purity, not for punishment's sake, but because the heart cannot thrive while entangled in the web of false worship. The covenant has always required clarity. From the moment Moses stood on the mountain, and the people trembled below, the terms were never vague. You shall have no other gods before me. It was not the beginning of a religion. It was the foundation of intimacy. And now, in a world brimming with distractions, where gods do not hide in forests but in algorithms, where altars are made not of stone but of screens and social metrics, the urgency is no less fierce. To come out of Babylon is to declare war on subtlety. It is to identify the false altars we have allowed to remain in our lives, not the obvious ones, but the hidden ones we justify. It is to confront the way we allow ambition to replace trust, entertainment to replace reflection, comfort to replace conviction. Babylon does not mind if Yahweh is worshipped, so long as he is not worshipped alone. That is the line she dares us to cross, the blending, the sharing, the harmless tolerance that dulls the edge of holiness. But Yahweh does not share his glory. He does not inhabit divided temples. He walks with those who walk with him, and the cost of following him has never been low. It demands separation, not from people, but from the spirit that seeks to possess them. It calls for radical faithfulness, a kind of loyalty that burns away excuse and walks straight into the fire, knowing he is worth it. This is not a call to be strange for the sake of being different. It is not a badge of superiority or a retreat into isolation. It is a return to covenant, a reclaiming of identity, a decision to live with undivided hearts, to serve with unfiltered devotion, to believe without bargaining. It is the posture of Daniel, who refused the delicacies of the king's table, not out of arrogance, but out of alignment. It is the resolve of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who stood before fire and still would not bend. It is the cry of Elijah, who faced a nation and asked, "How long will you limp between two opinions?" Radical faithfulness is not about perfection. It is about direction. It is about choosing again and again to walk toward the voice that speaks in whispers, even when the crowd shouts the opposite. It is about tearing down the inner altars that no one sees but heaven. It is about removing compromise not just from action, but from intention. To purify worship is to return to simplicity, adoration that is not for show, prayer that is not performance, obedience that does not wait for applause. It is to come before Yahweh not with polished appearances, but with truth in the inward parts, as Psalm 51 verse 6 describes. It is to remember that he does not dwell where he is tolerated, but where he is welcomed without rival. Walking in spiritual discernment is not paranoia. It is wisdom. It is learning to see the spirit behind the system. It is understanding that not everything that shines is sacred, and not every voice that claims to speak truth is rooted in light. Babylon knows how to speak the language of faith while selling the values of rebellion. Her table is full, her gates wide, her markets overflowing, but her soul is hollow. To follow Yahweh is to choose a narrower path, not because he enjoys austerity, but because life is found in focus. It is to live counter to the culture, not in bitterness, but in boldness. To live by covenant is to live by a rhythm that does not shift with trends. It is to say no when others say yes, to stand when others bow, to build when others destroy. The altars of Baal were torn down in moments of repentance. The high places were removed when kings remembered their calling. And so it must be now, not just in society at large, but in personal devotion. The call is not to look outward in judgment, but inward in surrender, to search the soul, to ask the Spirit to reveal where compromise has crept in, to tear down, to rebuild, to reestablish the sacred. Faithfulness begins not with public declarations, but with private decisions. It begins with what we turn away from when no one is watching, with what we say yes to when the pressure to conform rises, with how we respond when the whisper of Yahweh calls us back. It is the small daily choices that build into altars of obedience, temples not made by hands, but formed in lives consecrated to him. The story does not end with confrontation. It does not conclude at the edge of fire or in the shadow of broken idols. The journey through deception, compromise, judgment, and restoration leads to something deeper, something more enduring than signs, louder than thunder, and more consuming than any earthly flame. It leads back to the one who not only revealed his power in fire, but who has always made himself known through unwavering presence. Yahweh is not merely the God who defeats Baal. He is the God who calls his people back with open arms, who proves himself not through fear, but through faithful love that endures every failure and still offers restoration. Throughout every generation, from altars drenched in water to whispers in caves, from the downfall of Babylon to the echo of Revelation's final trumpet, Yahweh has shown himself constant. He does not change. His voice remains. His fire still falls, not always as lightning from heaven, but as transformation in the heart. Not every fire consumes outward things. Some fires refine what is within, burning away the false, rekindling the sacred, and drawing the soul back to its source. He is worth it all, not because he grants ease, but because he gives purpose. Not because he removes every storm, but because he walks through them. He is not silent in chaos. He is not absent in exile. He does not vanish in the valleys. His covenant was never a temporary contract. It was and is a vow, sealed not only by law, but by love. A love that disciplines, that waits, that pursues, that redeems. And so, as the final call echoes through the pages of Scripture and the fabric of this present world, it is not a call of fear, but of resolve. Choose this day whom you will serve, not with your lips only, but with your whole life. Tear down the altars that have taken his place. Reject the false fires that promise power without presence. Return to the one who answers by fire, not just to display his strength, but to restore your soul. This is not mythology. This is not metaphor. This is the living God, the one who stood with Elijah, who wept through Jeremiah, who loved through Hosea, who breathed through the prophets, who judges Babylon, and who returns as king. He is still calling, still whispering, still refining, still waiting. The God who answers by fire is not far. He is near to all who seek him in spirit and in truth. He is not impressed by ritual. He is moved by surrender. And to those who truly give him everything, he gives more than they could ever imagine. Not the shallow promises of modern idols, but peace that surpasses understanding, joy that survives the storm, and life that outlasts death. He is worth the cost. He always has been. And he always will be. If this message stirred something in your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future messages. Like this video to help others discover it, and write a comment to share your thoughts or prayers. We read every single one. And if someone you love needs to hear this truth, share this video with them. Let's spread the fire of truth together.